The cruelest lie is not that someone died. It is believing they are gone before the truth has the chance to breathe. Rain drifted quietly across the old cemetery, soft enough to blur the edges of every headstone, yet steady enough to soak the bouquet of fresh white lilies resting in Ethan Calloway's hands. Every first Saturday of the month, at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the same black luxury sedan rolled through the wrought iron gates before stopping beneath a towering maple tree, whose branches had watched countless seasons pass in silence. The driver never stepped out because he understood this ritual belonged to Ethan alone. 3 years had passed, but nothing about this journey had changed. Ethan climbed out wearing a tailored navy overcoat over a perfectly pressed business suit, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the rain-soaked grass as he walked toward the familiar memorial. Financial magazines still called him one of America's youngest billionaire visionaries. Television hosts praised his leadership. Business schools studied his decisions. Yet none of those accomplishments followed him into this place. Here, there were no headlines, no board meetings, no applause. There was only a man carrying flowers for the woman he had never stopped loving. He knelt carefully before the polished granite marker surrounded by blooming white lilies and brushed away a handful of damp maple leaves that had gathered across its surface. His fingertips rested gently against the cold stone, as though he feared even the slightest movement might disturb the memories sleeping beneath it. The engraved name stared back at him through tiny drops of rain. Naomi Brooks. Every month he whispered the same apology that no one else ever heard. "I should have answered your call. I should have been there. I should have found you." His voice disappeared into the quiet rhythm of falling rain. The engagement ring he had once planned to place on Naomi's finger remained tucked safely inside the inside pocket of his coat. Untouched for 3 long years, he carried it with him every time he came here, unable to leave it behind because letting go somehow felt like admitting the future they dreamed about had truly ended. Around him, the cemetery remained almost empty except for an elderly groundskeeper trimming hedges several rows away. The old man glanced toward Ethan with the gentle familiarity of someone who had witnessed the same quiet heartbreak month after month. After placing his gardening tools aside, he slowly walked across the narrow pathway and removed his weathered cap. "Good morning, sir," he said kindly. Ethan nodded without lifting his eyes from the memorial. "Good morning." The groundskeeper hesitated, clearly choosing his words with care. "May I ask you something?" Ethan finally stood, still holding the bouquet of lilies. "Of course." The old man looked at the polished granite marker for a long moment before speaking. "I have worked here for more than 20 years. I know every burial that has taken place in this cemetery because I maintain all of the records myself." Ethan listened politely, unsure why the conversation felt strangely different from all the previous visits. The groundskeeper sighed quietly. "I have wanted to say this for a long time, but I never wished to interrupt your grief." Ethan frowned slightly. "Say what?" The old man met his eyes with quiet compassion. "Sir, there was never a burial for anyone named Naomi Brooks in this cemetery." Ethan stared at him in complete silence. The rain continued falling exactly as before, yet the world around him suddenly felt unfamiliar. He slowly turned back toward the memorial, studying every engraved letter as if seeing the stone for the very first time. His heartbeat quickened while 1,000 forgotten questions rushed through his mind all at once. If Naomi had never been buried there, then whose goodbye had he spent 3 years mourning? The old groundskeeper's quiet words echoed through Ethan's mind long after the rain had faded into the background. He stared at the polished granite marker, unable to understand how a place that had carried every ounce of his grief for 3 years could suddenly feel unfamiliar. His fingers traced the engraved letters once more before he slowly looked back at the elderly man. "I attended the memorial service," Ethan said softly. "Everyone told me this was where she rested." The groundskeeper nodded with genuine sympathy. "I believe there was a memorial, sir. Families sometimes place a marker for someone whose final resting place is unknown. But according to every record we have, no burial ever took place here." Ethan thanked the old man, picked up the bouquet of white lilies, and remained standing beside the stone for several silent minutes. Questions he had never allowed himself to ask now returned all at once. If Naomi had never been buried there, what else had everyone simply accepted without knowing for certain? As the rain finally eased, his thoughts drifted back to the first day their paths had crossed, a memory untouched by sorrow. It had been an unusually bright September morning in Brooklyn when Ethan visited the East River Community Clinic after his foundation agreed to fund a pediatric expansion project. His executive team expected a brief appearance lasting no more than 20 minutes before another flight carried him to Chicago for meetings with investors. His assistant reminded him twice that the schedule was already running behind. Ethan nodded politely, but before leaving, he heard cheerful laughter echoing from a nearby examination room. Curious, he quietly stepped away from the tour and followed the sound. Inside, a young black doctor sat cross-legged on the floor beside a frightened little girl hugging a worn stuffed rabbit. Instead of rushing through the appointment, the doctor gently wrapped a tiny bandage around the rabbit's paw before smiling warmly. "Now your best friend is feeling much braver," she told the little girl. "Do you think we can be just as brave together?" The child smiled immediately and offered her arm without another tear. Ethan remained in the hallway watching something he had never seen in any hospital board presentation. There was no expensive technology or complicated procedure. There was only patience, kindness, and complete attention given to one small patient who suddenly believed everything would be all right. When the appointment ended, the doctor noticed Ethan standing quietly outside the door. She smiled with effortless warmth. "You must be today's visitor." Ethan extended his hand. "Ethan Calloway." She shook it once, firm but natural. "Nice to meet you, Ethan. I am Dr. Naomi Brooks." She said his name exactly the way she introduced herself to everyone else. There was no surprise, no excitement, and no hint that she recognized the billionaire whose face regularly appeared on magazine covers. She simply welcomed another person into her clinic. Ethan found that strangely refreshing. During the tour, Naomi explained the needs of the children instead of praising his donation. She spoke about expanding mental health services, improving family education, and making healthcare easier to reach for neighborhoods often overlooked. Every sentence centered on people instead of money. Before Ethan left, he thanked her for the conversation. Naomi smiled while holding the clinic door open. "Thank you for visiting," she said. "Buildings help people, but people change lives." Ethan walked back toward his waiting car, yet for the first time in years he was thinking about someone instead of the next business meeting. Without realizing it, the busiest man in America had just met the only person who would ever teach him that success meant very little unless it made someone else's tomorrow a little brighter. Over the next several months, Ethan found reasons to visit the East River Community Clinic that had very little to do with construction updates. At first, he convinced himself he was simply making certain his foundation's investment was creating real change, but every visit ended the same way. He stayed longer than his schedule allowed because Naomi always showed him something that numbers could never measure. She introduced him to children whose courage far exceeded their years, parents working 2 jobs while refusing to lose hope, and volunteers who quietly gave away their evenings because they believed kindness was worth more than recognition. Ethan had spent most of his life surrounded by people who measured success in quarterly reports and rising stock prices. Naomi measured success by the smile of a child who finally forgot to be afraid. It was a language he had never learned until he met her. One crisp October afternoon, after touring the nearly completed pediatric wing, Naomi suggested they walk a few blocks to a neighborhood coffee shop that overlooked the East River. The place was small, filled with local artists, students, and families enjoying slow conversations. Nobody paid much attention to the billionaire sitting by the window because Naomi treated him exactly like everyone else. She laughed when he admitted he had never ordered his own coffee before because assistants usually handled every detail of his day. "Then today is a good day to start," she teased with a smile. Ethan chuckled as he stood in line beside her, discovering that ordinary moments felt surprisingly extraordinary when shared with someone who expected nothing from him except honesty. Their conversations gradually stretched beyond hospital projects. Naomi spoke about growing up in Brooklyn with parents who believed education and compassion were the 2 greatest gifts anyone could offer the world. Ethan shared stories about building his first company in a tiny rented office where every dollar mattered and every setback felt enormous. They disagreed about plenty of things, especially when Ethan insisted every problem could be solved with enough resources. Naomi gently shook her head. "Money builds opportunities," she said. "Trust builds people." Those words stayed with him long after they left the cafe. Autumn slowly gave way to winter, and what began as occasional meetings quietly became part of their weekly routines. Ethan started protecting Friday afternoons from business appointments because he knew Naomi usually finished her clinic hours by then. Sometimes they walked through Central Park beneath bare trees while sipping hot chocolate from paper cups. Other times they volunteered together at community events organized by the clinic, assembling holiday care packages for families facing difficult seasons. Ethan noticed that Naomi remembered every child's birthday, every parent's name, and every promise she ever made. She carried hope as naturally as breathing, never seeking praise for the lives she touched. One snowy evening, after helping decorate the clinic for a winter celebration, they stood outside watching gentle flakes drift beneath the streetlights. The city around them seemed unusually peaceful. Ethan looked at Naomi, realizing that somewhere between hospital hallways, neighborhood coffee shops, and quiet walks through familiar streets, she had become the person he wanted to tell every piece of good news and every hidden fear. Before he could find the right words, Naomi looked toward the softly falling snow and smiled thoughtfully. "Tomorrow has a habit of arriving differently than we imagine," she said. "That is why I try to leave every day with nothing important left unsaid." Ethan smiled, believing there would always be another tomorrow waiting for both of them. He had no idea that those simple words would soon become the memory he returned to more than any other. Winter slowly surrendered to spring, and with every passing week Ethan found himself imagining a future that once seemed impossible to picture. His calendar still overflowed with board meetings, investor conferences, and international flights, yet every success felt incomplete until he could share it with Naomi. She remained the calm center of his increasingly complicated life, reminding him that even the busiest people could choose kindness if they made room for it. Together they celebrated the opening of the expanded pediatric wing at the East River Community Clinic, watching children race through bright hallways decorated with colorful murals, while grateful families filled every room with laughter. During the ribbon-cutting ceremony, reporters asked Ethan about the project's financial impact, but he surprised everyone by looking toward Naomi before answering. "The greatest investment is believing every child deserves hope," he said, repeating words she had spoken months earlier. Naomi smiled quietly from across the room, never seeking attention for the influence she had on him. Later that evening, they walked along the Brooklyn Bridge as the Manhattan skyline shimmered beneath the fading sunset. Ethan reached into the pocket of his coat, feeling the small velvet ring box resting safely inside. He had carried it for weeks, waiting for a moment that felt perfect, only to discover that every ordinary moment with Naomi already felt perfect enough. He almost asked her then, but she pointed toward the glowing skyline and laughed about a little boy at the clinic who insisted she could fix broken superheroes because she was a doctor. Ethan laughed with her, deciding there would be another day, another sunset, another chance. The following morning, he boarded an early flight to Boston for a business conference scheduled months in advance. Shortly after noon, while speaking to a room filled with executives, his phone vibrated quietly inside his jacket. He ignored it, assuming it was another routine message from his office. Minutes later, it vibrated again, then once more. During a short break, he finally glanced at the screen. 3 missed calls, all from Naomi. Before he could return the call, a voicemail notification appeared. He stepped into a quiet hallway and pressed play. Naomi's familiar voice filled the silence, gentle but carrying an unusual excitement. "Hi, Ethan. I know you are probably busy, but I really hope you hear this today. I have something important to tell you tomorrow. Cannot wait much longer, but tomorrow will be perfect. Call me when you can. Have a wonderful afternoon." Ethan smiled to himself. He considered calling immediately, but his assistant approached with several conference organizers waiting for the keynote session to resume. 5 more minutes, the assistant said apologetically. Ethan looked once more at Naomi's name on the screen before slipping the phone back into his pocket. "I will call her tonight," he replied confidently. She said tomorrow. The conference continued later than expected, followed by a dinner with investors that stretched well into the evening. By the time Ethan returned to his hotel room, exhaustion had overtaken every good intention. He looked at his phone, saw the late hour, and convinced himself it would be better to surprise Naomi with breakfast after flying home the next morning. As he closed the curtains overlooking the city, he remembered her words from the snowy evening months before. "Tomorrow has a habit of arriving differently than we imagine." He smiled at the memory without realizing that before dawn broke over New York, the tomorrow they both expected would quietly disappear, leaving behind questions that would remain unanswered for years. The flight back to New York felt longer than any journey Ethan had ever taken. Before the plane even reached the gate, his phone filled with missed calls from his assistant, members of the clinic board, and friends who rarely contacted him all at once. A heavy feeling settled over him as he returned the first call. His assistant answered immediately, her usually composed voice trembling. She explained that early that morning a passenger ferry traveling across the East River had experienced a devastating emergency after dense fog and mechanical failure forced an evacuation. Naomi had been on board while traveling to a pediatric outreach program organized for children in a neighboring community. Rescue teams had worked tirelessly throughout the day, and many passengers had been brought safely to shore, but several remained unaccounted for. Ethan barely remembered leaving the airport. He only remembered asking the driver to go faster while silently repeating that there had to be a mistake. When he arrived at the temporary family assistance center near the waterfront, volunteers, emergency officials, and worried relatives filled every hallway. Names were posted, updated, and checked again as information slowly arrived. Ethan searched every list, every waiting room, and every hopeful face, refusing to believe Naomi could simply disappear. He spoke with doctors from the clinic, members of the rescue teams, and anyone who might have seen her that morning, but every answer ended with the same heartbreaking uncertainty. Days passed before the official search concluded. Naomi's body was never recovered, but after every available lead had been exhausted, authorities explained that the river sometimes kept its own silence. Friends and colleagues gathered weeks later for a memorial service filled with photographs celebrating Naomi's life instead of mourning her absence. Children from the clinic placed handwritten notes beside white lilies, each one thanking the doctor who had made hospital rooms feel less frightening. Ethan stood through the entire service unable to say more than a few words. His grief felt unfinished, as though some invisible part of him refused to accept what everyone else had already accepted. After the ceremony, the clinic director handed him a carefully packed box recovered from Naomi's office. "She always meant to organize these," the director said gently. "Maybe someday they will help someone else." Ethan carried the box home but could not bring himself to open it. Instead, he threw himself into work unlike ever before, not to escape his memories but to honor them. Over the next 3 years, the Callaway Foundation funded children's hospitals, scholarships for medical students, and mobile health clinics across underserved neighborhoods throughout the country. Every ribbon cutting, every smiling family, and every new pediatric program quietly carried Naomi's influence, even when her name was never spoken aloud. Once each month, Ethan visited the memorial marker beneath the maple tree with fresh white lilies and the engagement ring that remained hidden inside his coat. Late one autumn evening, after returning from one of those visits, he finally opened the box that had rested untouched in his study for years. Inside were neatly organized patient thank you cards, notebooks filled with volunteer schedules, family photographs, and a small leather journal. As he carefully lifted the journal, a folded envelope slipped onto the floor. Across the front, written in Naomi's familiar handwriting, were only 7 words. "Search for the truth before accepting the easiest answer." Ethan unfolded the note with trembling hands, expecting more, but that single sentence was all it contained. Confused, he searched deeper through the box until a thin medical transfer document slid from between 2 folders. Most of the page contained routine administrative information, But one handwritten notation near the bottom caught his attention immediately. It read only 2 words: transferred quietly. Ethan stared at the paper for a long time, realizing that for the second time in a single day, everything he believed about the past had begun to unravel. Sleep became something Ethan no longer expected. The 2 words written across the transfer document echoed through every quiet hour of the night. Transferred quietly. They were too deliberate to dismiss as an administrative mistake, yet they raised more questions than answers. Early the next morning, he instructed his assistant to clear his calendar indefinitely, something he had not done since founding his company. Board members protested, investors requested meetings, and television interviews were postponed without explanation. For the first time in years, the billionaire who planned every minute of his life chose uncertainty over certainty, because somewhere beyond those 2 handwritten words might be the truth Naomi had asked him to find. His search began in New York. He returned to the East River Community Clinic carrying copies of the transfer document and Naomi's handwritten note. Most of the employees who had worked beside her had moved on, but a retired records coordinator agreed to meet him in a small archive room tucked beneath the original building. Dust-covered rows of aging filing cabinets filled with patient records, volunteer rosters, and administrative paperwork stretching back decades. Together they searched through boxes for nearly 6 hours before uncovering a faded shipping log listing medical files forwarded to another hospital shortly after the ferry emergency. The destination, however, had been crossed out with black ink years earlier, leaving only the initials of the receiving office. It was the first lead, but it was painfully incomplete. Ethan followed every possibility those initials suggested. He traveled to Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, and Norfolk, speaking with hospital administrators, nonprofit directors, and retired physicians who had served during those years. Each conversation began with hope and ended with another closed door. Some remembered emergency transfers after the ferry incident, while others recalled volunteer doctors being reassigned to rehabilitation programs along the East Coast. But no one could confirm Naomi's name. Weeks turned into months. His search carried him through quiet coastal towns, busy medical centers, and forgotten community clinics where handwritten records still occupied shelves instead of computer databases. More than once he believed he had finally found the answer, only to discover another woman with a similar name or another incomplete file that led nowhere. Friends gently encouraged him to let the past rest. Even his closest advisors questioned whether grief had simply become impossible to release. Ethan listened respectfully, but every disappointment only strengthened his belief that Naomi's note had never been meant to comfort him. It had been meant to guide him. One rainy afternoon in Charleston, South Carolina, while reviewing archived volunteer directories at a regional medical association, an elderly librarian noticed the photograph Ethan carried inside his notebook. She studied Naomi's smiling face for several quiet moments before speaking. "I cannot be certain," she said softly, "but I believe I saw this doctor several years ago. She visited here looking for children's outreach programs after recovering from a long medical leave. She eventually accepted a position with a small nonprofit clinic farther down the coast." Ethan's heart began beating faster than it had in years. "Do you remember the name?" The librarian disappeared into a storage room before returning with an old directory of charitable medical organizations. She carefully turned several yellowed pages before placing her finger on a single listing. Harbor Light Children's Center. The clinic sat in a quiet seaside community nearly 80 miles away, far from the attention of major cities. There was no guarantee the information remained accurate, yet for the first time every piece of the puzzle seemed to point in the same direction. As evening sunlight broke through the passing rain, Ethan folded the directory into his briefcase, started his car, and drove south along the coastline with a feeling he had almost forgotten existed. It was not certainty. It was hope. The drive to Harbor Light Children's Center followed miles of quiet coastline, where salt marshes stretched toward the horizon and weathered fishing boats rocked gently against wooden docks. It was nothing like the towering skyline Ethan had called home for most of his life. The small seaside town moved at an unhurried pace, its streets lined with family-owned cafes, white churches, and modest homes wrapped in flowering gardens. As he parked beneath a row of ancient live oak trees draped with Spanish moss, He found himself gripping the steering wheel longer than necessary. For 3 years he had imagined this moment in countless different ways, yet now that he stood within a few steps of a possible answer, he was suddenly afraid to discover that hope could disappear one final time. Harbor Light Children's Center occupied a restored brick building overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Children's laughter floated through open windows, while colorful drawings decorated the entrance. Everything about the place reminded him of Naomi, not because she had ever mentioned it, but because every detail reflected the same quiet belief that healing began with kindness long before medicine. Ethan stepped inside and introduced himself to the receptionist, explaining that he was searching for a physician who might have volunteered there several years earlier. The woman studied his face with polite curiosity before asking him to wait. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Ethan looked around the cheerful waiting room, noticing shelves filled with books, handmade quilts donated by local families, and photographs of community events covering one entire wall. Then he heard footsteps approaching from the hallway beyond the reception desk. He turned almost instinctively, and time seemed to lose all meaning. A woman wearing a white medical coat walked into the sunlight streaming through the windows, carrying a clipboard tucked gently beneath one arm. Her natural curls rested softly against her shoulders, and the warm smile she offered a little boy leaving an examination room was exactly the same smile Ethan had carried in his memory every single day for 3 years. Naomi stopped walking. The clipboard slipped slightly in her hands as her eyes met his across the room. Neither of them spoke. The sounds of the clinic faded into an almost impossible silence as disbelief settled over both faces. Ethan searched every familiar detail, almost afraid that if he blinked she would disappear like another unfinished dream. Naomi's eyes slowly filled with tears she made no attempt to hide. She took one hesitant step forward before stopping again, as though she needed to be certain he was truly standing there. Ethan felt countless emotions rise at once: relief, confusion, gratitude, and a sorrow so deep that words could not contain it. He had imagined shouting, demanding answers, or running toward her, but none of those things happened. Instead, he simply whispered the only word that mattered: Naomi. She closed her eyes briefly after hearing her name spoken in his voice again. When she opened them, the gentle smile he remembered slowly returned, carrying years of quiet resilience rather than sadness. "Hello, Ethan," she answered softly, almost as if they had only been apart for a few days instead of 3 years. The receptionist quietly stepped away, sensing that something extraordinary had unfolded before her. Sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the room with a warmth that seemed almost unreal after so many years of unanswered grief. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat without thinking. The small velvet ring box was still there, exactly where it had remained through every season of loss, every monthly visit to the memorial, and every mile of his search. He did not remove it. He only rested his hand against it while looking at the woman he had mourned, realizing that the impossible had quietly become real. Before either of them could say another word, Naomi looked toward a nearby consultation room and spoke with gentle calm. "There is a great deal I need to tell you, and none of it will make sense unless we begin at the beginning." Naomi led Ethan into a quiet consultation room overlooking the ocean where afternoon sunlight reflected gently across the water. The peaceful setting felt almost unreal compared to the years of unanswered questions that had brought him there. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at one another, allowing the impossible reality of their reunion to settle into something they could finally believe. Naomi broke the silence first. "I owe you the truth," she said softly, "and I have carried that truth every day since I remembered who I was." Ethan nodded without interrupting. He had spent 3 years imagining countless explanations, but now all he wanted was to hear her voice again. Naomi folded her hands together and slowly began. On the morning of the ferry emergency, she had been traveling to a pediatric outreach program when the sudden crisis forced everyone aboard into a terrifying situation. She remembered helping frightened families remain calm before everything became a blur. When she regained consciousness several days later, she was in a regional trauma hospital hundreds of miles from New York after being transferred with other unidentified patients during the overwhelming emergency response. She had survived with no life-threatening physical injuries, but the physicians soon realized she was suffering from significant memory loss caused by the trauma. She could remember medical procedures, childhood songs, and fragments of ordinary life, yet she could not remember her own name, where she lived, or the people she loved. Because she carried no identification that survived the accident and no immediate family could be located through the limited information available at the time, she entered a long rehabilitation program under temporary administrative protection while specialists worked patiently to restore her memory. Months slowly passed. Volunteers, therapists, and doctors became her temporary family. She learned to walk confidently through unfamiliar days while hoping pieces of her past would eventually return. A nonprofit medical network later invited her to continue recovering while serving in community clinics, where she could gradually return to the profession that still felt familiar, even when everything else remained hidden behind a fog. Harbor Light Children's Center became that place. Helping children gave her purpose while her own identity remained incomplete. Nearly 2 years after the ferry emergency, memories began returning unexpectedly. A child's stuffed rabbit reminded her of a little girl in Brooklyn. The smell of coffee brought back quiet mornings beside the East River. Then one evening she suddenly remembered Ethan's smile, his voice, and the life they had dreamed about together. She searched online and discovered news articles describing memorial services, charitable foundations created in her honor, and stories explaining that everyone believed she had died. Naomi lowered her eyes as tears quietly formed again. "I wanted to come back immediately," she whispered, "but I had already seen how much love people poured into remembering me. I thought reopening those wounds after so much time might only bring more pain. I convinced myself that your life had surely moved forward, that you deserved peace instead of another impossible beginning." Ethan slowly shook his head, emotion filling his voice without anger. "My life never moved forward. I simply learned how to keep breathing." Naomi looked at him with quiet heartbreak before reaching into a drawer beside her desk. From inside she removed a familiar leather journal. "That note I left behind was written long before the ferry," she explained gently. "I always believed that the easiest answer is rarely the complete one. I never imagined those words would someday lead you back to me." Ethan smiled through grateful tears, realizing that the woman sitting across from him had never chosen silence out of indifference. She had chosen it because she believed she was protecting everyone she loved. After another quiet moment, Naomi looked toward the sunlight dancing across the ocean before meeting his eyes once more. "Do you think," she asked with hopeful uncertainty, "that two people can still begin again after losing so much time?" Ethan looked at Naomi for a long moment before answering, not with grand promises or dramatic declarations, but with the quiet certainty that had grown inside him through every season of loss. "I do not think we can begin where we left off," he said gently, "but I believe we can begin where we are." Naomi smiled through grateful tears, and for the first time in years neither of them felt trapped by the past. They spent the following days walking along the peaceful shoreline after the clinic closed each evening, talking about everything time had stolen from them and everything it had unexpectedly given back. Ethan told her about the children's hospitals, scholarship programs, and neighborhood clinics that had been built because her compassion had forever changed the way he understood success. Naomi listened with quiet amazement, realizing that although they had been separated, their lives had continued moving toward the same purpose. Before returning to New York, Ethan finally reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed the small velvet ring box he had carried for 3 years. He smiled softly as he opened it. The ring inside had never left his side, traveling with him through airports, boardrooms, lonely hotel rooms, and every monthly visit to the memorial beneath the maple tree. Naomi looked at it with tears shining in her eyes before gently closing the box again with both hands. "Not today," she whispered warmly. Ethan nodded without disappointment. "Whenever tomorrow arrives," he replied with a smile. Several weeks later they returned together to New York, not seeking attention or public celebration, but quietly visiting the place that had carried so much sorrow. The old groundskeeper recognized Ethan's familiar car before it reached the cemetery gates. As he walked toward the memorial carrying his gardening hat beneath one arm, He stopped in complete astonishment when he saw Naomi standing beside Ethan beneath the maple tree. His weathered face slowly brightened into the kind of smile that only appears after witnessing something truly extraordinary. Without saying a word, he simply embraced both of them. The polished granite marker remained where it had always stood, surrounded by white lilies blooming in the gentle spring sunshine. Ethan rested one hand against the stone one final time before looking at Naomi. "This place helped me survive," he said quietly. "Now it should help other people find hope." Months later, the memorial site had been transformed into the Naomi Brooks Memorial Garden, a peaceful space filled with flowering trees, benches, and pathways dedicated to families overcoming grief and beginning again. Nearby stood a small plaque carrying the same handwritten words Naomi had once left inside her journal. "Search for the truth before accepting the easiest answer." Visitors often paused to read the message before continuing through the garden, never realizing how many lives those simple words had already changed. Inspired by their journey, Ethan and Naomi expanded the Callaway Foundation into a nationwide partnership supporting children's health clinics in underserved communities across America. Every new clinic emphasized compassionate care, family support, and mental wellness, reflecting everything Naomi had always believed healing should be. Years later, whenever reporters asked Ethan about the greatest achievement of his career, he never mentioned billion-dollar companies or global investments. He smiled, looked toward Naomi greeting children in another bright clinic hallway, and answered with quiet gratitude. "The greatest success of my life was learning that hope deserves one more chance than fear. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle hidden inside every human heart. Sometimes life does not restore what was lost by turning back the clock. Sometimes it simply places two people on the same path again after they have both become strong enough to recognize that love is not measured by the years they lost, but by the courage they find to begin again."